Stand by 1 minute while I get the live stream going, and then we will begin the presentation. All right, stand by 1 minute. All right, we are now live on Facebook, and it is now 7:30, time to get started. So welcome everybody to tonight's edition of Breaking the Chain. Right now, just a few rules of engagement as we get started. We've done a couple of these. We've learned quite a few lessons as we've done this. Again, we're going to keep everybody's video turned off during the presentation, and we're going to keep it muted. The other thing that's going to change is if you leave the meeting during it, you will not be able to get back in. So make sure that you stick around for the whole presentation. Here shortly, in about 5 minutes, anybody trying to join will no longer be able to get in either. And we're doing this to kind of lock the meeting down to make sure we don't have any unexpected interruptions like we have had in the past before. So we're going to hold all questions until the end. So if you have any questions, there is a chat feature that you can chat your question in the chat feature, and if it's something that I can interject into the speaker during the process, I will do that. So go ahead and use that chat feature as you need to. Towards the end, I will allow people to unmute themselves and turn their video on, and we'll have a more interactive kind of session with question and answers towards the end. We do, again, for all the people who just started joining us, we are going to turn everybody's video off, and we're going to begin the presentation. So again, hold questions to the end. If you do have questions that you want during the process, use the chat feature, go ahead and chat them, and I'll relay that to the presenter, and we'll get that going. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy and let him get this session started.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back for the third webinar of Breaking the Chain. I want to say that I appreciate everybody joining in tonight. And without further ado, let's just go right ahead and get into this presentation. Next slide, Ken. Okay, so for tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about what the WINGS program is, and we'll have some introductions. We'll talk about what the mission statement and end state is of the Breaking the Chain program, and then we'll actually have the presentation itself. We'll have an open forum question and answer session, and then we'll talk a little bit about some things on our closing comments. So next slide, Ken. Okay, for those of you guys that don't know what the WINGS program is, go to that website right there, FAAsafety.gov, log in, build yourself a profile. That's the FAA Safety Team is what that stands for, also known as the FAST Team, and it's where you can acquire WINGS credit. The real cool thing about getting in with the FAST Team or becoming a member on this website is that you get all kinds of notifications just like the ones for this briefing tonight. Webinars, and as soon as this COVID stuff is finished, more so seminars. I'm a lead FAST Team member within the San Antonio FSDO area, and what I try to do is get subject matter experts together, host these webinars, seminars. Oftentimes I'll host these workshops, and it's all in an effort to further promoting aviation safety. All right, next slide. Okay, so Ken Viard is the technical guru for this presentation tonight. As many of you know, Ken Viard runs the Pilot Partner program. And Pilot Partner has been providing electronic pilot logbook software since 1997. They offer a full feature of electronic pilot logbook solutions to track your flights, flight tools, endorsements, currency, a CFI dashboard for instructors to track their students, and more. For the last 2 years, Pilot Partner has integrated the pilot logbook with their fleet management system, allowing flying clubs and partnerships to automatically invoice members, track maintenance, and keep tabs of their budgets. Basically, a great logistics tool for all of those who are trying to form a club. Next slide. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeremy Walters. I'm a professional pilot, former Army aviation officer. I flew 864 Apache helicopters on active duty. I currently fly a Hawker 800. I like to teach. That's really what my true passion is. I teach multi-engine, float planes, working on being a full-on Robbie instructor pretty soon, and in helicopters. And I fly a Hawker, as I already mentioned, I fly a Hawker 800. I'm a Gold SEAL instructor, and I'm currently a sitting major in the United States Army Reserves, where I fly at dusk, actually. I also have an aviation YouTube channel, and it's basically there to promote aviation safety, education, the adventure, and mainly going out and doing something bigger and better with your life. That's the real push for, which is all American aviation. Next slide. All right, so I met Pat Brown about 4 years ago. Pat Brown is a good friend of mine, and I've invited him to be my guest speaker tonight. A little background on Mr. Pat Brown. Pat is a AOP Texas You Can Fly ambassador. He has been flying since 16. He's accumulated nearly 10,000 hours of flying and about 6,000 hours of dual given. That's more than my total time. Along with a gentleman by the Mark Grady, Pat developed the original Rusty Pilot Seminar. Let me know if you guys had any questions about that, because that's a really great program, and that's how I actually met Pat. He has traveled the country doing safety presentations and flight instructor refresher clinics for the Aviation Safety Institute. He's a Cirrus and standardization instructor pilot, Malibu check airman, and recently he was appointed as a designated pilot examiner. He's rated in both single and multi-engine airplanes, as well as gliders, and most importantly, seaplanes. So that's our guest speaker for tonight, Mr. Pat Brown. Next slide. And I've got kids in the background tonight. I'm playing Mr. Dad, Mr. Mom right now, because Mom's at work. So you may hear them making noises in the background, but we're just gonna roll with it. All right. So what is breaking the chain? All right. Well, everybody knows, well, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people know that there's a series of events that lead from the beginning of a flight to a crash, right? And those series of events are known as links in the chain. And we call that chain the accident chain. So our goal is to eliminate or mitigate the links in the chain, or at least one link in the chain, to prevent the accident from happening. Next slide. So this is the mission of the program. The mission is to influence the aviation community, to apply lessons learned to the future, to enable a safety-minded culture, to protect our fellow pilots, aviation as a whole, and set an example for those around us to follow. And the end state, what's our goal? Carry away a break in the chain mindset for future operations, not just limited to aviation, but in our daily lives, to mitigate the risk of any incident that can lead to damage to property, injury, or loss of life. So how do we do it? Next slide. These are some of the areas that we've kind of come together to figure out a way to break the chain in the future. Basically, research, planning. A major one is training. Be self-aware of human factors flaws. In fact, Pat always mentions 4 human factors flaws in most of his meetings that usually contribute to an accident. I won't steal his thunder. Maintaining a break in the chain mindset and thinking like a professional aviator. What does it mean by thinking like? What does it mean by maintaining a break in the chain mindset? It means thinking ahead, being a professional, finding a way to protect yourself from getting into a bad situation. I know that's a little broad, but that's generally what we're trying to walk away from. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off the baton to the presenter tonight, Mr. Pat Brown. You have the floor, sir.
Hello, Jeremy. How are you?
Good, sir.
Good. It looks like 50 or 60, maybe 70 additional people that are tuned in. You know, you mentioned seaplanes, and I'm just as a shameless plug for a really, really terrific magazine that happened to come in the mail today. When I got my tailwheel endorsement, I thought that was the most fun that I'd ever had in an airplane. Up until that time, it was. When I got my glider rating, I thought, man, this is the most fun I've ever had in airplanes. And up until that time, it was too. And then I got my seaplane rating. And I can say without question that that is the most fun I have ever had in an airplane. And Jeremy and I get to fly together periodically and keep my chops up. I will tell you this, though, the first time I lined up on a short final and there's a windscreen full of water, my first thought was, that ain't right. Hey, something wrong here. But I'll tell you, after that first landing, and it's just amazing. At any rate, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about non-towered airport operations. You know, this is, I fly out of a non-towered field. There are far more non-towered fields out there than there are towered fields. And so you're more likely to come upon one of these things. And in some ways, it's the wild, wild west. And one of the reasons that we strive for standardization is to take some of that craziness out of operations around non-towered fields. But even with standardization, even with all the references that are out there on how to do things and do things right, there's still those yahoos out there, and you know who they are, that just think those rules are not for me. Those are the anti-authority type folks here. So let's take a look at the next slide, and let's talk about why this is so important. If you take a look at the NTSB and look at virtually any of their reports in terms of mid-airs, you're going to find, perhaps surprisingly enough, that most of them happen during the daylight in good visibility, usually within 5 miles of a non-towered field. Now, as I was looking into these stats, one of the things that I did not realize is that it happens most often with both airplanes are flying in the same direction. That was a real eye-opener for me. Also, most pilots are not on a flight plan, and trust me when I can tell you, trust me because I can tell you, it can happen to pilots of all experience levels. I have been party to at least 2 fairly close calls in my flying career. Both of them were as a result of someone else not doing what was expected of them in a particular situation, whatever that might have been. So let's go on to the next slide, if we could, please, Ken. And we're going to take a look at where all of the information comes from that we're going to talk about tonight. Everything that we talk about is going to come either from AIM Chapter 4-3-3, the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, specifically Chapter 14, the Airplane Flying Handbook, again, specifically Chapter 7, or AC 90-66B. If you're an insomniac, just pick up 90.66B and read it for about 15 minutes. You'll be out like a baby. But there's some really, really good information on there. A lot of right-of-way stuff while you're in the traffic pattern, things that sometimes are not covered as well as you might hope in the AIM. So 90.66b is a good one. Let's talk a little bit about right-of-way before we get into some of the other meat here. And that will be on the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, please, Ken. So the question is, who has the right-of-way? Well, if you look at the sketch right there, obviously the glider will have the right-of-way over the powered airplane. But 91.113 says basically that when you're converging, the least maneuverable airplane has the right-of-way. If you're going head-on, each person is expected to alter to the right. And next one, Ken. If you'll click on the button there, because there's something behind. Yeah, there you go. If there's an aircraft being overtaken, the faster aircraft passes to the right. And landing, here's an interesting one. Landing, the lower of the two airplanes has the right of way. But the rule says, 91.13, and in quotes, the lower airplane shall not take advantage of this roll to cut in front of another, which is on final approach to land or to overtake that aircraft. So basically, you're not supposed to use the fact that you're lower to an unfair advantage, if that makes any sense at all. So if you kind of understand that kind of business, then you're halfway there to being much safer in an airport traffic pattern that's not a towered field. Let's go ahead to the next slide, if we could, please. And let's talk a little bit about our mission today. We have a fairly easy mission today. We're flying from Valdosta, Georgia. That's a towered field in Class Delta airspace. About 35 miles or so up to Thomasville Regional. And that is a non-towered field. Now, let's go to the next slide, if you would, please, Ken. I said it's a non-towered field, so that pretty much negates the first question. Is this a towered airport? Of course, I can hear all of you saying collectively, no, it's not. It's not. It's not because notice that it's a magenta color. Non-towered fields are magenta. Now, you might say, are there any such thing as towered airports in Class G airspace? Well, in fact, there are. They're rare, but they're out there. If you look at 91.126 parenthesis D, you'll find out that they're there in Class G airspace. You have to treat them as Class Delta. Now, how are you going to find out? Well, if you see a towered field without any circles around it, like a Class Delta or Class Charlie or something like that, that will be blue. So if you see a blue airport symbol, that has got to be treated like Class Delta airspace, even though it may be sitting in Class G airspace, as in the case of Thomasville, which is in Class G airspace. How can we determine the weather? Pretty simple. It's got an AWOS on 119.175. But the next question then is, do we have left traffic or right traffic? And if you look at the airport data block there, below the last line, 264 with an L and a 60 and the frequency there, if it was anything but left traffic, there would be an indication below that. It would say RP with the number or numbers of the runway or runways that are right-hand traffic. So that's how you're going to know if this is left or right-hand traffic. You can always also look at the chart supplement, which used to be called the Airport Facility Directory. But typically, this is the easiest way to do that. Just look at the airport diagram and the data block that's associated with that airport diagram. Ken, next slide, please. Well, we're going to listen, 10, 12 miles out, 15 miles out. We're going to listen to the traffic, to the weather on the AWOS. And as you know, it just repeats over and over and over and over again. And in this particular case, we're going to hear that the wind is 090 at 7, scattered at 2,900 feet with an altimeter setting of 30.02. One of the first things that we want to do is decide what is the traffic pattern altitude for Thomasville. Well, if you look at the airport data block right there, you'll see that the airport sits at 264 feet MSL. We're going to add 1,000 feet to that because that's typically the traffic pattern altitude at most airports. There, by the way, there are some exceptions to that. You'll find that in the chart supplement, if in fact there is an exception to the rule. But we're going to assume, because I didn't look, that 264 feet is the MSL altitude. We're going to add 1,000 feet to that and round up to give us 1,300 feet. So 1,300 feet indicated our traffic pattern altitude. But let's go to the next slide, if we could, please. But we've got a dilemma here. The wind is 090, which is halfway between favoring runway 4 or favoring runway 14. You have an equal crosswind on each one of those. So how are we going to determine how we're going to enter the traffic pattern there? Maybe we could just enter a right downwind on runway 14 and be done with it. That's certainly the most direct way to do it. But if you look at CFR 91.126, it says very clearly all turns shall be to the left. And when you see the word shall relating to an FAR, it means you don't have a choice. You will do it that way or else. There are other words out there that you'll see that you may do this or you can do that. But when you see the word shall, that one is pretty well not negotiable. Let's just put it that way. So if we take a look a little bit closer, let's see how radio calls made by airplanes that are already in the traffic pattern, or frankly, that are already on the ground, could help us eliminate or reduce any confusion and help us decide what we're going to do. So if we could, please, Ken, let's go to the next slide. So some of you who may have been to one of my Rusty pilot seminars might recognize this particular slide. Let's start, number one, with just listening. When you're 10 miles out, listen for a little bit. If there's traffic in the pattern, you're going to know pretty well what runway they're landing on. In this particular case, it's a toss-up. And you could certainly choose the other one if you wanted to, but that really wouldn't be safe. So listening for a while before you make a radio call is probably going to be a good thing to do. That way you can figure out where everybody is, what they're doing, and figure out the best way for you to fall in line and get in sequence and everybody's happy. Keep in mind that there is no active runway at a non-towered field. There's only the runway in use. And if you doubt what I just said, go ahead and read that advisory circular, and it'll tell you that in black and white, that there's no such thing as an active runway at a non-towered field. That's one of the reasons why I don't particularly like the term taking the active. My first response, and I've joked about this many, many times, is where are you taking it? And where are you going to bring it back? I'm going to need it here in a minute. But there's a more serious reason for that being perhaps not the best way to talk about it. And so think about this. If you back, this is years ago, before New Braunfels had a tower, before San Marcos had a tower, and currently down in Palacios, which has 3 runways. All of airports have 3 runways. And in every case, 2 of those runways could be active pretty much on any given day because of the prevailing wind. So if you're departing and you just say, I'm taking the active, somebody else is flying in out of, coming in off course somewhere, and they're trying to figure out what runway to use, and you say taking the active, you haven't told them anything whatsoever. And the same thing for somebody that's just landed when they say clear the active. It doesn't really tell anybody anything. Of course, all this other stuff around the traffic pattern is really just kind of a little fun here. It makes no sense whatsoever to talk about turning downwind, to beam the numbers. I'm midfield downwind, I'm going to beam the other numbers, I'm turning base, I'm on final about to turn, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't make any sense. So if we can take a look at the next slide, this will clear things up and clean things up considerably. So if you were to say, in this case, Thomasville Regional, Cessna 12345 is departing runway 4, or if it's runway 14, I'm departing runway 4. That tells any incoming traffic without question without question, what runway is in use. And so it would allow you to just jump into the appropriate place in line and again, land in sequence. We're going to talk about entering the traffic pattern in just a couple of minutes here. So departing runway 4 or departing runway 14 as the case may be, or I'm clear of runway 4. Cessna 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, clear of runway 14. A little cleaner way to do it. If you are working in the traffic pattern, just report turning crosswind, turning downwind, turning base, and turning final. Why? Because you're in the corners and you're going to be up at an angle in the bank, so you're going to be more visible pretty much there more than anywhere else in the traffic pattern if you're in a bank. And in the corners, people kind of intuitively know where to look. So turning crosswind, turning downwind, turning base, turning final is really probably plenty. So let's take a look at the next slide if we could. And now let's talk a little bit about getting into the traffic pattern. All of you have seen this, I'm sure, in one form or another. It's in AIM. It's in the Airplane Flying Handbook. It's in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. It's in that advisory circular that we talked about. And it shows the old tried and true 45 degree to the downwind leg. We've all seen it before. We're probably sick of seeing it, but that's it. It's been that way forever and ever and ever. That's just really a good way to do it. It's safe. It puts you in flow with the rest of the traffic and so on and so on and so forth. Could we look at the next slide, please, Ken? All right, this one is one that I will tell you, frankly, I am not a big fan of, because if it's flown incorrectly, it can be simply the most dangerous way to enter a traffic pattern. Now, let me explain why I feel that way. First of all, I've almost been hit once coming into West Houston Airport from someone who was flying this traffic pattern incorrectly. I was coming in from the east, entering a 45 degree to the downwind to runway 15, and this other person was coming in from the west flying this type of traffic pattern. If you're going to fly this kind of traffic pattern, adhere to what this diagram says and look at it very closely. It says to fly at least 2 miles past the downwind leg, not the center line of the runway, past the downwind leg. Most single engine airplanes fly a downwind leg somewhere between, I don't know, 3/4 of a mile or so to a mile from the runway. 3/4 of a mile is good. A mile gets a little bit wide, but hey, some people like that. So if you're talking about a mile on the downwind leg, now you're talking about going out 3 miles from the airport before you make that 180 back. So if you fly the traffic pattern this way, personally, my objections are mitigated a bit. I still don't much like this particular entry, but if you go out 3 miles, maybe 4 miles from the airport and then turn back, you're getting yourself well clear of the airport traffic pattern, allowing yourself plenty of opportunity to see oncoming traffic who may well likely be at your altitude or below you. And notice that it says overfly the field 500 feet above the highest pattern. And the highest pattern could be 1,500 feet, because that's what multis and turbines are supposed to fly to non-towered field. So you may have to fly quite a bit above that traffic pattern in order to be able to turn around and come back in. Now, why is it the most dangerous, or potentially the most dangerous if you don't do it right? As a flight instructor and also as a designated examiner, I have seen several cases where the pilot has entered the traffic pattern like this, but almost directly over the airport, the pilot starts a descending turn to the right to enter the left downwind. The problem with that is that when you, in this particular case, let's assume that up is north and down is south. If you're flying in this configuration, according to this slide, and you start that descending right-hand turn to the south, you are virtually on the downwind leg flying in the opposite direction. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to realize that that is a potentially deadly situation. So without beating a dead horse too much, if you're going to fly this type of entry, which by the way is in the in the airplane flying handbook in chapter 7. This diagram is there. Please be careful and please fly far enough away from the airport in order to make sure that you're not going to be a hazard to you or anybody else that might be flying in from the opposite direction. I hope that makes some sense, and we can certainly have some conversation about that at the conclusion of the program. If you would please, Ken, let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. This one, you probably have seen this one before. It's not really in any of the books per se, but entering a midfield downwind and turning directly to the final is a way that that often, in fact, that was one of the ways I was taught to do way back in the dark ages. Obviously, you're going to give way to any opposing traffic. You don't want to cut somebody off who might have entered an extended downwind, which is another subject that we can talk about at some point down the road. But there's inherently there's nothing really wrong with this. But certainly, if the traffic pattern is busy, you really don't want to be trying to do this. It's too hard to sequence yourself in. And the thing that I don't like about this one, especially if you're flying a fast airplane, is if you haven't properly planned your entry into the traffic pattern, you could find yourself going too fast to get your landing gear down or to get your flaps down or what have you, which might cause you to have to fly a downwind much, much further away from the airport than you might ordinarily have planned to do. And if there are other airplanes in the traffic pattern, you could really cause that nice orderly sequence of airplanes to all of a sudden turn into a bunch of people flying a 747 type of traffic pattern. So if you're going to do it like this, make sure you have your airspeed under control and that you can get the airplane slowed down. Let's go to the next slide if we could, please, Ken. This is another option that I have seen, and in fact, typically this is what we do at West Houston Airport. Most people seem to like this one because it gives you the full length of the runway to get slowed down. Over the departure into the runway, it's unlikely that any departing traffic is going to be at traffic pattern altitude by the end of this 4,000-foot runway. Now, if you're taking off out of a runway that's 7,000 feet and you happen to be in an RV, it's certainly possible that you could be at the threshold or the departure into the runway by the time you hit 1,000 feet. So this may not be a good entry for an airport like Texas Gulf Coast Regional, for example, which has a 7,000-foot long runway, and it's a non-tower field. So again, all of these things that we talk about are subject to using good judgment and good common sense. Let's go to the next slide if we could. This next one, the good old straight in approach. Again, I'm not a fan of this one at all. I've seen so many people who announce a 10-mile final, and first of all, by the time they get anywhere near the airport, everybody has forgotten that they were on a 10-mile final if they even heard that radio call. So that's not a really good practice. If you're flying an instrument approach, unless it's a circling approach, then by definition it's going to be a straight in. There are still some ways though that you can mitigate that risk. If it were me, I would say something like West Houston traffic, Cessna 12345 is 4 miles to the north inbound on the RNAV practice approach to runway 15. Straight in, full stop, traffic permitting. And I would add that last statement, traffic permitting. It lets anybody else in the traffic pattern know that I don't expect them to stop what they're doing and extend their downwind because I was too lazy to join the traffic pattern in sequence and come in like a good neighbor. So straight ins, just because you can, is not necessarily the best thing to do. Of course, all of this that we're talking about is predicated on using good judgment and making good, clear radio calls. So let's go to the next slide because that gets into, we'll get in a little bit into radio do's and don'ts at this point. So this is a short list. You can probably add 100 others of your own from your own experiences. This is just a short list in order to try to keep this this discussion at least reasonably interesting and relatively short. So tune in and verify the radio frequencies. How many times have you as a pilot mistuned a radio? Now, if you're saying, no, I never have, then it's just a matter of when will you? Because all of us have at one point tuned an improper radio frequency, an incorrect radio frequency. I've actually had the radio turned down giving dual instruction. We switched to the right frequency and I've forgotten to turn the radio up. And so we're making radio calls and wondering why it's so quiet in the traffic pattern and why nobody else is making radio calls. And that's because I forgot to turn the radio up. So, you know, it can happen to everybody, no matter what your level of experience is. Monitor before you speak. In other words, listen. Just listen before you speak. If you can listen for a while, just as in the previous slide, listen for a couple of minutes, and you'll generally get a pretty good idea. Let's go back to the that other slide. There you go, Ken. Thank you. You'll get a pretty good idea of what's happening and how many airplanes are in the traffic pattern and whatnot. Speak clearly. You're not being paid, as the slide says, by the number of words you can squeeze into a few seconds. We have all heard that person who is trying to emulate an air traffic controller and ends up not being understood by anybody. And then you have a bunch of people scratching their heads and saying, I wonder where this joker is. Be concise, be accurate, be gone. In other words, we're not going to have a long, drawn-out radio call. We're simply going to say, West Houston traffic, Skylane 713 Sierra Mike, 5 miles to the west, inbound landing, West Houston traffic. Done and one and gone. And we're going to continue listening, and we're going to continue making the appropriate radio calls as we turn onto the downwind, onto the base, on the final, etc. So I end this radio dues with, again, in caps, just listen. And it's not just listen before you speak. Listen always. Listen the entire time. There are a lot of people potentially flying out of a non-tower field, particularly on a really, really pretty day. So listening to where they are and trying to figure out in your head, from a spatial standpoint, where they are and get a mental picture of where all these people are is a really, really important thing to do, and can add greatly to safety. Radio don'ts, here's just a couple of them. Engage in chit chat with other airplanes or other pilots. We are all guilty of doing that. Once again, I'll raise my hand and I'll say, I'll be first in line with saying I'm guilty of doing that. It's not great practice, and we really should not do that. Another one is announcing your every move while taxiing. There's really not any need to announce that you're taxiing from the ramp out to the runway, unless it's like the Katy Freeway on rush hour. For those of you in Houston, you'll know what I'm referring to. If you're in Austin, I-35, 24 hours a day. Unless you're in an incredibly busy non-towered situation, there's really no need to announce what you're doing. People can see that. So that just adds to the radio chatter, especially if there's a lot of people in the traffic pattern. It's just unnecessary radio chatter that just, again, it's just unnecessary. Okay, next slide, please. On your radio calls, let's say you're landing and you're reporting SHUI inbound. Well, unless you're an instrument-rated pilot who flies out of that particular airport, nobody is going to know where SHUI inbound is. And the thing is, you hear this all the time. So as I alluded to earlier, in the case of a practice approach, a better radio call might be West Houston traffic, Cirrus 816 Lima Tangos, 5 miles north, inbound on the RNAV 15 practice GPS approach, landing full stop, traffic permitting, something like that, short, sweet, to the point. Most final approach fixes, and this in SHUI is actually the final approach fix on a runway to the Frederick, Maryland airport. If most final approach fixes are somewhere between 4 and 5 miles from the threshold of the runway. Sometimes they're a little farther, but normally 4 to 5 miles. So if you, instead of reporting on the final approach inbound or SHUI inbound, then you want to talk about your distance from the runway. And again, don't forget to add traffic permitting, because we want to be a good neighbor. We're nice people, pilots, generally speaking. We want to be nice people. Let's go to the next slide, if we would, please. Let's talk about position reports just a little bit. 52 echoes over the Cheese Whiz factory. Where in the heck is the Cheese Whiz factory? Unless you live next to the Cheese Whiz factory or close by to it, you aren't going to have a clue. So a transient pilot gets nothing out of a radio call like this. I was flying not too long ago with a student. We were doing some instrument training, and I heard approach control to tell an airplane going into hobby to report over the Astrodome. Well, those of you that are at least somewhat familiar with the area will know that the Astrodome is really kind of hard to miss. It's a big building. But this pilot says, where's the Astrodome? And you might laugh at that. And of course, local pilots all got a chuckle out of that. It was all over social media that afternoon. But let's think about that from a serious standpoint. You're coming in from somewhere you don't really know, and they're telling you to look for the Astrodome. Where are you going to look? You don't really know where that is in relation to hobby. So, you know, it really is, it's fun to make fun of them, but it really is kind of mean because this pilot really and truly didn't know. So good, concise reports are important. To drive that point home, let's take a look at the next slide. We're 2 miles east. Well, you could be really a lot of places in 2 miles east. I think if you look at the slide here, you'll see that the 2 miles east kind of covers a lot of territory. You 2 miles northeast, you 2 miles east, you 2 miles southeast. So this is not a very clear sign. Next slide, please, if you would, Ken. So while that's a little bit too general, this is probably a little bit too precise. I mean, I'm on a pi mile final. Yes, I said that, a pi mile final. That's a little bit too precise, because if you can tell the difference on the ground or in the air looking at another airplane at a radio call that says I'm 3.2 miles away from West Houston Airport versus I'm about 3 miles away. If you can tell the difference in 0.2 of a mile, boy, you must be Bob Hoover or Chuck Yeager with eyes like an eagle, because I sure can't. We no need to be that precise, but be concise, be accurate, but you don't have to get it down to the 1/10 of a mile, because GPSs can do that for you, and it just doesn't matter at the end of the day. So with that in mind, let's talk about, these are just some personal pet peeves, and those of you who know me have heard me talk about this. We can go to the next slide if you would, please. Thank you, Ken. Those of you who know me have heard me talk about this ad nauseum, and you have actually made great fun of me. You've taken great pleasure in laughing at me about all of this stuff, and that's perfectly okay. But taking the active is number one. It's certainly, in fact, I'll just say these are in no particular order, but the very last one is my top pet peeve. So taking the active is one for obvious reasons we talked about before. Clear of the active, that's another one. We talked about that before. The next one, starting every call with and Houston Center, Cessna 12345 with you at 6,000 feet. That's just one of those things. No reason to start with and the with you is not necessary either, but at any rate, that's neither here nor there. Here's the next one here, left final. Folks, there is no such thing as left final. There is a final approach. There's a left downwind and a right downwind and a left base and a left and a right base, but there's no left final. Last call. I have heard this more in the last, probably 3 or 4 years than ever before. I don't know where it came from. I don't know where its origin is. Nowhere, anywhere in AIM, in the radio section or the communication section, does it say last call is a necessary call. It never even mentions last call. So I got involved with a conversation with a flight instructor some time back. I was doing a check ride with a young fellow, and he did a really, really good job, passed the check ride, everything was fine. But as he was leaving the traffic pattern at West Houston Airport, he said last call. So being a diligent DPE and making notes that I want to talk, so I wrote down last call. So during the debrief, we got through with it, and I said, I got a question for you, and I posed it to the student, to the newly minted private pilot, and I said, you said last call leaving the airport at West Houston. Why'd you do that? He said, well, my instructor taught me to do it. So that's the way to throw your instructor under the bus. That's skill number one that student pilots need to learn, is how to throw your instructor under the bus. Well, he did. So I looked at the instructor and I said, why do you teach him last call? And the instructor said, well, So when I'm leaving the traffic pattern, I just want people to know that it's the last opportunity they had to say something to me before I leave the frequency. So I said to him, well, when was the last time anybody said, wait a minute, Bill, before you leave the frequency? And he kind of looked at me sheepishly and he said, well, never. So, you know, I said, I rest my case. If you really feel the necessity to make a call like that, then I might suggest that it might be something like West Houston Traffic, Cirrus 816 Lima Tango, departing the traffic pattern to the west. Be done with it. They know you're about to change frequencies. And again, this is just a pet peeve. It means nothing. It's just something I can vent to 60 or 70 fellow pilots. This is the big kahuna. For me, this is like fingernails on a chalkboard for those of you that are old enough to remember chalkboards in school. I think nowadays they have whiteboards, but in my day, they had chalkboards. And if you put your fingers on them just right, oh, it made the most awful sound that you can imagine. Any traffic in the area, please advise. AIM, chapter 4.1.9, actually calls out this phrase specifically and says it should not be used in any way. It's not a recognized appropriate traffic call. Should not ever be used. Yet you hear it all the time. I heard it from a TBM driver coming into West Houston this afternoon during a check ride. Should never be used. Why is it a big deal? Or why does it cause such controversy? Well, let me see if I can kind of at least give you my take on it. Number one, if you look back on a previous slide where it says radio do's and don'ts, one of the first ones was dial in the frequency and just listen. Just listen. If you listen for 30 seconds or 45 seconds, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what's happening in the traffic pattern. If you don't hear anything in 30 or 45 seconds, the chances are that nothing is happening in the traffic pattern. If you say any traffic in the area, please advise, and you don't hear anything, what do you know? Well, there's probably nothing happening in the traffic pattern. So why bother with jamming up the airwaves with that particular frequency? If you make that call and 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people trying to be good Samaritans all key the mic at the same time and try to answer you, what are you going to hear? Well, I know all of you are saying right now you're going to hear all kinds of squealing, and I'm going to say, yeah, it's going to be squealing like a bunch of teenage girls at a Justin Bieber concert. You're not going to know anything except that a whole bunch of people have keyed the microphone. Does it tell you how many people are in the traffic pattern? No, it doesn't. So, all right, so what should you do? A couple of things. Number one, if you're flying into a non-towered field that you know typically has a monitored Unicom, and West Houston Airport is one that does. West Houston traffic, Cirrus 816 Lima Tango is 10 miles to the west inbound landing. Do you have any traffic reported in the traffic pattern? Now you're talking to one person who can answer that question because he or she will have been listening to the radio and have a fairly good understanding of what's happening in the traffic pattern. The other thing would be if you don't hear anything, then simply announce your position. West Houston traffic, Cirrus 816 Lima Tango is 10 miles to the west inbound landing. If there's someone in the traffic pattern who has a radio, who hasn't been making radio calls because, hey, there's nobody else in the traffic pattern and I just don't want to talk, that will usually persuade that person to start making radio calls. And at that point, now you have an idea that there's somebody else in the traffic pattern. So I feel like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. And if you don't understand that reference, you can look it up. But I do feel like Don Quixote tilting at windmills when it comes to any traffic in the area, please advise. And now last call, because they're really just useless radio calls. And in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, just bad. It's just bad. It shows it's amateurish. All right, let's go to the next slide, and I'll stop beating dead horses here. But thank you for listening, and you're free to agree or disagree as you wish, but rant over. All right, we get on the ground at Thomasville. We've decided what runway we're going to land on. We didn't bend any metal doing it, and we did have a VFR flight plan, which we chose to open. We've got to remember to close that flight plan because if you don't, Trust me when I tell you that somebody will come looking for you. Some years ago, this happened to be an IFR flight plan, but I can assure you the same thing happens with a VFR flight plan. A few years ago, I was flying and doing some IFR practice, and I landed at Texas Gulf Coast Regional Airport on an IFR flight plan. That's a non-towered field, and as you know, there's nobody to cancel an IFR flight plan for you at a non-towered field, but you, in this case, me. Well, I forgot to do it. We went to the FBO, had a soda, chatted on the ground for just a little bit, and had a good time, and walked back out to the airplane maybe 20, 30 minutes later, and there was a sheriff's department car sitting patiently by the airplane waiting for us to come. And he asked which one was the pilot, and I raised my hand sheepishly. And he said, you forgot to close a flight plan. He said, here's a telephone number. And he handed me a sheet of paper with Houston Approach Control's telephone number on it. I called them, and they weren't ugly, but they were very clear that I had held up arrivals to that airport for 15 minutes and that I should really not forget to do that again. So with a VFR flight plan, you're not going to hold up arrivals, but I can promise you that if you haven't closed that flight plan within 45 minutes, somebody will be looking for you. I guarantee it. So how do you close that flight plan? Well, if you look at the bottom below the airport information data block, you'll see the Thomasville RCO. RCO stands for Remote Communications Outlet. They're all over the place, but you do have to kind of look for them a little bit. In this particular case, it's probably co-located on the Thomasville Airport. I haven't looked to see, but I would guess that it's co-located on Thomasville Airport. So that's, in that case, either in the air or or just before you shut down, you could dial in 122.55, and you could call it flight service. In this case, it's Macon Radio, and cancel your VFR flight plan. If you can't reach them in the air or on the ground, you can certainly use your cell phone. If the battery's died on your cell phone, you might find some archaic dinosaur outside the FBO called a pay phone, and that's assuming now you may not be usable if you don't have a quarter or whatever it costs now to make a call. So check your chart, look for the RCO. Call flight service you can also call 1-800-WX-BRIEF, and they'll close the flight plan for you. So there's a number of ways that you can do that, but ATC is not going to be a help in this particular case. Let's go to the next slide if we could, Ken, and you can kind of go right past this next slide to the one right after it. We're departing a non-towered field. Now, some years ago, we switched over from taxi into position and hold to line up and wait. That was a part of the ICAO thing, which originally introduced class A, B, C, D, E, and G airspace. And then after a period of time, we began to further comply with the ICAO and went to the line up and wait jargon. It might be interesting for you to know that at a towered field, before they can give you a line up and wait instruction, this is a towered field now, there have to be 2 controllers in the cab. And you might say, well, why is that? And well, the obvious answer is because you've got one guy to give you the instruction, another guy to be watching your 6. And that would be the reason. You want to have somebody else watching for an airplane that might have inadvertently started the final approach or something along those lines. So Ken, if you'll hit the next slide, we'll let you know this is why that's a bad idea at a non-towered field. So the result of this little coupling here is not baby airplanes. It's a big bad insurance claim. That's what that is. This particular event happened at North Texas Regional, up just on the northwest side of Dallas some years ago. In fact, I was doing a Rusty Pilot seminar about a year and a half or so ago at Alliance Field in Fort Worth. And I showed this slide, and a gentleman in the front row raised his hand and said, that was me. And it turns out that it looks, if I remember right, the Cherokee on top was not making radio calls. And of course, the Stinson, who at least he said he was making radio calls, but with that high wing, taxied out. And of course, the high wing, low wing thing. And this is the result. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but a big, big insurance claim. Let's go on to the next slide, Ken. We're almost done here. So if you look at AIM and the AFH and all the documents that we talked about, you're only going to see reference, at least as far as I have been able to find, and I'll admit that I haven't spent hours and hours looking, so your mileage may vary, but all of the documents that I've been able to see indicate that the proper way to enter, to depart a non-towered field is to get straight out and then keep going, or straight out and either a 45-degree turn to the left or to the right, depending on which way the traffic is flowing. So if it's in a left-hand traffic pattern, then you'd make a 45 degree to the left. If it's a right-hand pattern, because that's the way the segmented circle or other regulation pertaining to that particular airport states, regulation is not the right word, but the custom at that particular airport, if it indicates a right-hand traffic pattern, then you'd make a 45 degree to the right. But what if you have left-hand traffic and your course lies to your right? Well, there's nothing that I've been able to find that specifically gives best practice for something like that. So we're kind of left to our own devices. And so I guess the best thing that I can say is use some common sense. If it were me, I would probably continue to fly straight out, continuing to climb, assuming the airspace in the area allowed me to do so. And then at what would appear to be, to me, a safe distance from the airport, maybe a couple of miles or so, go ahead and make my right turn out on course. So that's about the best advice and the best guidance that I can give you on that. Again, if you find something that gives more definitive information or recommendation on that, I would certainly welcome it. I don't pretend to know everything or be an expert on every nuance, but this is about the best I can find. So I hope that's good enough. Ken, the next slide here, if you would please. Okay, so I just want to go back and review very quickly all of the information that came for this presentation is from AIM Chapter 433, from the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 14, and from the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 7. So all of that information, plus this advisory circular 90.66b, all the information that we talked about today comes from those sources. If you have any questions, we can certainly open the forum here in just a couple of minutes. If there's something that you want to communicate to me specifically about, my email address, and I should have put this up here, but my email address is pat.brown@aopa.org, pat.brown@aopa.org. So please feel free to drop me an email if you want to talk about something beyond perhaps what the time will allow when you're here. Be more than happy to have a discussion with you. In the meantime, if we can have the next slide up real quick. Thank you for attending. That is about all I've got for tonight, and I really do appreciate your attention. I saw some questions start to come through on my iPad. My pleasure, Ian. Thank you. So I saw some questions and things like that come up. I don't know how you want to do this now, Ken or Jeremy. If you want to take control of the presentation and open it to discussion.
Yeah, so at this point, I have allowed people to unmute themselves. There has been some great questions during this. I did not interrupt the presentation with them because I think quite a few of them actually got answered by the content that was in there.
Okay.
For those people who want to continue the discussion, feel free to unmute yourself and start the, I guess, Stephen, go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Yes, we can.
Well, I appreciate you letting me. Y'all are in Texas. Most of y'all, I guess, are in Texas. I'm in South Carolina, but this was an interesting subject that happened to come up recently. Just as a little background, I was listening to the audiobook, The Killing Zone by Paul Craig the last couple of weeks. And one of the issues that came up in one of the chapters was about non-towered airports and straight-in landings and things like that. But I wanted to relay this last weekend. I finally went up flying for the first time in about 6 weeks with COVID in a 172 and went in to a local airport that I'm used to flying in, but I run.
Looks like we've lost Steven's audio.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Gordon, if you can hear me.
All right, go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah. Hey, just a couple of comments. First off, for Pat, there's never a horse dead enough that you can't beat one more time.
Thank you for that.
I worked for Sikorsky Aircraft, and I had that in my byline, actually, my signature, and the HR people had me remove it because they thought it might be offensive to horse owners. So, anyway, my comment for you is in the very beginning when you were talking about the runways in Thomasville, you phrased the runways 4 and 14.
Yeah.
As opposed to 4 and 1-4.
Yes.
Is not the standard or terminology 1-4?
Yeah, it's 1-4. I was being a little bit careless there. I should have said 1-4, but you're right. 1-4 is the proper phraseology. If I was making a radio call, I would say, you know, Thomasville Regional Cessna 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 left down when runway 14.
Yeah. Okay. Good copy on that. And thanks. It was a great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm a Corpus Christi guy, so not too far away.
There you go. Love Corpus.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is Mark. If I could ask a question. My instructor, when we were doing training, always asked me to announce, you know, when I was on departure leg and departing the pattern. Is that something that is recommended, or does that fall more under the category of, you know, announcing a last call?
What was it, something like XYZ traffic, this is Cessna 1, 2, 3 on the departure leg, departing the pattern?
Yeah, we'd say like depart, you know, runway 33 departure leg, departing the pattern to the north, or something along those lines.
You know, I don't want to come across like being some sort of, you know, radio, you know, Gestapo or something like that. You know, I just believe in keeping it short and sweet and to the point. And the departure leg, if you say that you're departing runway 15 and you're and in fact you're rolling on runway 15, for example, anybody coming in is going to be watching for you departing runway 15, including, you know, straight out along the departure leg. But again, as with all of this stuff, and I know this is probably not giving you a black and white answer, because in so many of these cases, there really isn't a black and white answer per se. If saying something like were taught to say enhances the safety of in the operations in the area where you are, in your airport area, then go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And just one other question I had. Just in terms of right away in the pattern, if a plane is established in the pattern, do they have the right of way over airplanes trying to enter the pattern?
Yeah, yes, they do.
They do. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Including somebody coming in on a straight-in approach. If you look at that advisory circular that I mentioned, 90.66, that actually addresses exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Pat, it's Eric Myers. Great as always to hear you and always learn something from you. So, and never forget your pet peeves. So that's all good. Hey, one question, and I know I've talked to you about this in the past, but it's still been a little bit fuzzy to me. For the IWS entry that you talked about is preferred on the departure end of the runway. I'm curious what altitude you're at when you do that, how you think about that, if there are other planes departing, and what you actually call as a radio call.
At traffic pattern altitude, so in case of West Houston, 1,100 feet indicated. My radio call is usually West Houston traffic, Cirrus 816 Lima Tango is crosswind directly over the departure end of the runway. for a left downwind 1.5.
So with other aircraft, isn't there the potential if they've got a really, strong climb rate that you might be in conflict with a departing aircraft, or how do you think about that?
Well, I look at it, partly I look at it, what is the length of the runway? We have 4,000 feet at West Houston. Unless we have a really hot rodded up airplane, it's unlikely most of the airplanes that are based at West Houston are going to be able to have that kind of climb performance. Now let's talk about Texas Gulf Coast Regional, which is, about a 7,000 foot long runway. If I were to enter the crosswind of that runway and there was an RV taking off, there's a very good chance that I could be in conflict. So that midfield entry, the one that we talked about, might be another way to do it. When it comes to entering a traffic pattern from anything other than the 45 degree to the downwind, and I'm going to call that from the wrong side of the field. If you're on the right side of the field, then you're going to enter a 45 to the downwind. If you're on the wrong side of the field, you got to figure out a way to get on the right side of the field in order to be able to enter the traffic pattern. And in my mind, there's no best way to do that. Every single traffic pattern entry from the other side or the wrong side of the field carries its own set of challenges and risks. And so it's really up to you as the pilot to assess what those risks are and figure out what is the quickest, cleanest, safest, and most expeditious way to get onto the other side of the airport to enter the downwind leg. If you were to say, well, I'm just going to circle way around, let's just say again, it's a north-south runway and you're landing to the south. I'm going to circle around way around to the north, and I'm going to come around and circle into a 45. Well, okay, but be careful what altitude you're flying at, because if you've got somebody flying a practice instrument approach, for example, you could be in conflict with that person. If you say, well, I'm going to fly way down underneath around the south side of the airport and come back around, well, that's all fine and dandy too, except you may be in conflict with somebody doing a straight out departure, which according to AIM is the way you're supposed to leave if you're going to fly straight out. So, I hope that if nothing else, I hope this conversation tonight just opens up perhaps some other thinking. Maybe the way you're doing it, there's a better way to do it, or maybe it just confirms that the way you're doing it is the right way. But, in my mind, there is no single answer to how to enter the traffic pattern from the other side of the field. Does that help at all, Eric?
Yeah, it does. It does. Just last question. If you end up doing kind of the AIM recommended entry, do you call it a teardrop entry, or how do you call that? Because I've heard people call it various ways.
Yeah, I've heard it both ways. A very popular way to do it is to announce that you're overflying the field and making a teardrop entry to the left downwind, and that seems to be the most common. And it's probably the most descriptive as what you're doing. But again, if you're going to do it that way, make sure that you fly far enough away from the airport traffic area so that you really and truly are not endangering other people that are already in the traffic pattern. Because like I told you before, as some gentleman said, you can never beat a dead horse dead enough. But this really has the potential of being a quite dangerous way to enter the traffic pattern. And if I hadn't almost had a midair as a result of that, I might not feel so strongly about it. And I'll without spending too much time more on this, but I was doing a safety seminar 6 or 8 months ago, and I was doing my usual rant on the teardrop entry to the downwind leg. And a gentleman called me on the telephone a couple of days later, and he said, I didn't want to say this in the seminar, but I disagree with you on that. And I said, I'm all ears. Tell me what your thinking is. And he said, well, when I'm landing in Pearland, you know where that is, it's down past the Astrodome to the east a little bit. He says, if I'm coming in from Pearland, I routinely overfly the field and fly out a good 3 or 4 miles before I start in. He said, flying 3 or 4 miles out gives me a chance to look around, see who's there, listen to the radio, and sequence myself into the downwind leg. And I thought to myself, you know, here's a guy that's doing it the right way. And he's thinking strategically as to why he's doing it, not just because his instructor or somebody said, hey, enter the traffic pattern this way. And it really did cause me to moderate my opinion on that, because you'll notice when we talked, you know, earlier in the program, you'll notice that I said something to the effect that if you fly it properly, but if you fly it improperly, such as starting that descending turn into the downwind leg from directly over the airport or nearly so, now you're putting yourself in conflict with the downwind leg and potentially having this kind of a head-on type of collision. And not to mention the fact that you're descending into the traffic pattern, which is also a no-no. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's certainly helpful. Thanks for that, Pat.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Pat, this is Norm here. Can I beat your dead horse for one more moment?
Yeah, I know how you feel about that traffic pattern, Norm. Go ahead.
Well, we're not that far apart, but the one thing I just wanted to say, you sort of implied, but I think it bears beating one more time, that you don't start losing that altitude until you are that 2 to 4 miles past the airport, where some people start to lead off and start losing that altitude as they're crossing the downwind. You want to be 2 to 4 miles away and then start losing your altitude.
Yes, and for those of you who probably don't recognize Norm Eisler is my colleague and fellow ambassador in New York. And he covers the greater New York area, Pennsylvania, and parts of Ohio, if I remember right, Norm. And does Rusty Pilot seminars and Rusty Pilot webinars and helps start flying clubs and does exactly the same thing I do here in Texas, only up in New York. And I really do appreciate you being here, my friend. Thank you for adding that. You're absolutely right.
Oh, nice that I don't have to make a shameless plug for myself. Thank you.
I would expect nothing less. Anybody else?
Pat, I've got a question.
Hi, Marissa.
This is Marissa. Okay, so like if you're flying let's say a VOR approach, when you execute a go round, it's obvious you're going to go join the pattern, right? This is an untowered airport, annunciations or calls. Let's say that you're going missed and you're going back to a hold, and that hold could be the VOR behind you. What is the best? I think for the most part, they're going to avoid the traffic pattern on those published hold instructions, but you can't really say I'm executing the published missed because VFR people aren't going to know what that is or where you are. So what would the best course of action be there to announce that you are executing a published missed and going, for instance, back to a VOR that's behind you?
Right. At West Houston Airport, we used to have a VOR Delta approach that was based off of the Intercontinental VOR. And that approach on radial 239 actually bisected the airport right smack dab in the middle of the runway if your VORs were calibrated properly. And the missed approach point was literally over the runway. And so the way that we would typically announce the missed approach, first of all, the MDA was 600 feet. Well, that's, 500 feet below traffic pattern altitude. So we're below traffic pattern altitude going over the middle of the runway. But pretty much from the final approach fix, about every half mile to a mile, we would make a call that we're 4 miles to the west on the VOR approach. We'll be overflying the field at 600 feet. And those calls would be on a regular basis. When we were over the top of the field, it would be, for example, West Houston Traffic Cessna 12345 is midfield, turning southbound and departing the traffic pattern, or departing the area, I think we said. So, and also talking about our altitude. So again, trying to, in this particular case, probably over communicating is probably better than under communicating. but at the same time, you don't want to tie up the frequency to the point where nobody can get a word in edgewise either. So it's a balancing act. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I think some of the ones that I've been flying kind of spit you out midfield anyway.
Yep.
So it's a cross and then, continue to climb and then, head to whatever. So you just announce whatever direction you're headed to go back to execute that published miss.
Yeah, I think that's probably a best practice. And if, and if you were going to be landing at that airport, which would by definition be a circling approach more than likely, then you again you're over communicating in some respects, because it's going to depend. Have you been allowed to break out at traffic pattern altitude and join the downwind, or have you been told that you can't break out until the MDA and you're circling altitude is 600 feet, which is 500 feet in our case below the traffic pattern? So in both cases you're really kind of doing something non-standard. You're entering the traffic pattern at a 90-degree angle, not necessarily 45, or you're entering the traffic pattern at 500 feet below the traffic pattern altitude, either which is not standard. So it calls for extra diligence, and all eyes on deck, especially the instructor obviously should be looking. And when the student comes out from under the hood, again, paying attention to the traffic as well as flying the airplane. Circling approaches are really dangerous, and that's one of the reasons.
I can definitely tell you that is the case, because you're already 500 feet above the ground and not being able to, I was instructed not to climb because you could potentially get back in the clouds.
That's exactly right.
So
Yeah,
you want to
approach.
stay, and that is very, very, very low to be circling to another runway, but it's the way it's done. And I guess just self-announce and how high you are at that point.
Yep, that's the best you can do. Of course, we need to practice them at least periodically, because even though today the likelihood of you getting a circling approach is between slim and none, it isn't beyond the realm of possibility, is it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Pat. Steve Dixis here. How you doing?
Good, Steve. How are you?
Good. Hey, just an observation. The pandemic has locked me down, so I haven't been going out very much. But I'm not plugging these guys, but the guys over at pilotworkshops.com, I went through their VFR communications course,
right,
from cover to cover, and they present about 79 different areas as far as communications go. They don't talk about pattern entries. They just talk about just how to talk on the radio in different situations. So, if anybody's looking for a source, that's just one to use in order to basically, it helped me out a lot, because it actually exposed me to some things that I really hadn't been exposed to. And it gave me some insights as far as how to communicate on the radio better and use it effectively. But, to cover everybody back in the, as far as the traffic pattern goes, I basically go back to the aviate, navigate, communicate. Aviate and navigating in the traffic pattern are probably the most critical. And then the communication part, it'll be there when you get to the right points in the traffic pattern.
Yeah, fly the airplane. Absolutely, fly the airplane first. I'm going to have to do an investigation here, because I think there's some deep state stuff happening here. Plugging pilot workshops there. I think maybe they're paying you to do that.
No,
I'm
they're
just
not.
kidding. I'm kidding. It's a great organization. I've got a really good friend, a double I here in Houston, who just completed all, I think he said 114 of their scenarios, because he didn't have anything better to do.
Yeah, I did the same thing while here. I did their IFR as well, and I tell you, it's an eye opener.
Well, we partnered with them. The last two safety seminar series that AOPA did, we partnered with them to provide the content. And it's first class. It's absolutely first class. I can't recommend them enough. So thanks for mentioning that, Steve.
Yeah. Good to see you. Take care.
Thank you.
I guess this is Steve Blanton again. Can you hear me all right?
We got you loud and clear, Steve.
Yeah, I don't know what happened before. I was in mid-sentence, and next thing I know, I was out of Zoom, and then I had a hard time getting back in. But
Well, welcome back.
But anyway, so I don't know what y'all talked about while I was gone trying to get back in, but to finish.
We were actually talking about you.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it said maybe he was flying and he crashed while he was talking, right?
What was your question? I don't remember.
so anyway, I entered I overflew, entered the pattern using your number 2 that you had gone, kind of a overfly and direct entry in. But then, there was somebody on a 10-mile final. You talked about a 10-mile final. And like I said, I'd just been listening to that, the Killing Zone audiobook, and they had talked about that, as one of his chapters, if you're familiar with that book. And who has right of way, and, all turns to the left, but straight ends are okay, and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so I had that in my mind when I entered, and then somebody said they were on a 10-mile final, and I didn't really pick up what kind of airplane it was, so how fast it was, and I had this in my mind about right away and all that. So I asked him if I had time to get in front of them, and they said yes. So I uneventfully left pattern, did a touch and go, went back around again for a second time in the pattern, and then somebody else was on a straight in final, and they asked me, they said, hey, can I get in, or you want me to divert? And I said, and I had them in sight, or knew where they were, had them on ADSB. So I said, no, you go ahead and go in, I'll extend. So while I was extending and it just, finally wingtip to wingtip and was getting ready to turn base, somebody behind me, some student pilot behind me, turned base at him. And he made a comment, hey, I'm right here. And of course, I just announced that I was on an extended downwind, turning left, left base after, passing the other guy on the long final. And this person was behind me. And next thing you know, they're announcing that they're turning base after I was on that long base, or not long base, but extended downwind base. And of course, the guy on final, hey, said, I'm here getting ready to land and all that kind of stuff. And I said, hey, I'm here, or something like that. And then the instructor chimed in and said, you need to extend your downwind, or something like that. So I don't know if it was a student pilot on their first solo or something like that. But we all survived and everything like that. And actually had a conversation after that with my sometimes instrument instructor and other instructor, about some of the things that because I'd run into him at the airport when I was taking off. He was landing at the Tower Airport locally, and so we talked later, and he had something similar happen to one of his students on his first solo at another local non-Tower airport. So we had a lot to talk about. But anyway, yeah, it's definitely an interesting world out there sometimes. So anyway.
It is. I say it can be the wild, wild west, and it's all fine and dandy to sit here and talk about the nuances and the academics and all of that kind of stuff, and but out in the real world is really where it all matters. And it doesn't matter if you're right, if you're dead right. So sometimes it's better just to extend that downwind and let's have that conversation, because you might have the right of way, but it isn't safe to take it. So
yeah, I have another anecdote at the same airport. I don't want to take somebody else's thunder, but it's the same airport at another time on a Civil Air Patrol local SAREX. So I was piloting a plane, but I don't want to take somebody else's thunder if they got to say something. But anyway.
Well, I don't know.
Well, anyway, it was about a year ago. It's that local non-towered airport, which I fly with Civil Air Patrol a lot. And I'm not a high time pilot or instrument pilot or check pilot or anything like that, just a VFR pilot with them. And but I was piloting a plane on a local little SAREX last May, actually. And coming in from, we found the airplane and we were coming in and going to switch crews, training and everything like that. And for those of you not in Civil Air Patrol, search and rescue exercise is what it is. We were just doing a simulated exercise, found a simulated downed airplane, called it in, and then was coming back to trade crews and let somebody else go out and do training and all that. And and somebody called in and said, this is one of those airports with it's got a left pattern on 17 and a right pattern on 35. because of residential development in the past and all that. And I was coming in on for 3-5, so I was on right pattern coming in, and somebody in the pattern said they were doing a left for the same runway, and I said, I made an announcement. I said, this is a right pattern for 3-5. And so this person said that they would come in behind me and all that. And I never had them, and I had 2 other crew members in there, and none of us ever spotted this guy, but he said he was coming in behind me and everything like that. Next thing I know, we're getting ready to touch down on 3-5, and this guy is coming at us from the opposite direction. I was getting ready to touch down. He was a little higher, so he did a go around, but and we didn't. We were basically opposite ends of the same runway, but again, it's those type of things, and people getting mixed up about where they are and what they're doing and all that kind of stuff. So I know my right seater, who was also a Civil Air Patrol pilot, he jumped while I was tidying up. He jumped over to talk to the other guy and all that kind of stuff, and I ended up filing a NASA report on it. And our safety guy for our Civil Air Patrol SARX, he was ticked off about the whole thing, and he was really. But anyway, so non-towered airports and what can happen. So anyway.
Yeah, if it can, it will.
But I'm here talking to you, so I lived through both of them. So anyway.
I was gonna take a moment and I guess maybe stir the pot a little bit. How about those situations where you're flying to a non-towered airport out in the middle of nowhere, you're listening to the radio, you're doing everything right, there's nobody there, and it's just so much easier to make that right base entry into there and not fly all the way around to do that. Are there times to not follow best practices, or when nobody's looking, is it okay if you've checked boxes and done that you can take the shortcut?
Well, I think I'm trying to remember. I think it's 91.126. I think it was. It says all traffic shall be turn to the left. So if you really want to if you want to pick nits, you're breaking a reg. Now, is it one of those regs that that you can break? Well, yeah, but if it's okay to break this reg, maybe it's okay to break another reg. And if it's okay to break that reg, it's probably okay to break this other reg. And at some point now you've got what Jeremy talks about, I think in one previous breaking the chain, the normalization of deviation. So, if you're looking for absolution to fly a right base just because it's quicker and more expeditious, I can't, in good conscience, with my DPE hat on, say, sure, go ahead and do that. I would just leave that between you and your conscience. So stir away.
It's always fun to stir the pot, but I also find that just good communication on the radio, you follow the standard practices, but occasionally you get a fast aircraft, because I fly the Bonanza coming in, and things tend to happen a lot faster if I'm trying to stay efficient and all that good stuff. But if it's busy, I'm slowing down, getting sort of 172 speeds and all that to fly in. But if it's just one other person in the airplane, in the pattern, a simple, okay, here's your plan, here's my plan, we're not going to conflict, goes a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Being efficient in communication, not tying up the radio too much in case there's a third guy that neither you two know about that doesn't get a chance to chime in. But just some good, simple, common sense communication goes a long way to keeping non-towered airports a lot safer.
I think that was one of the things that we more or less ended the slide deck with was, it's a lot about common sense. It's obviously see and be seen and try to avoid bending metal. And a lot of it at some point just comes down to just plain good old common sense. And, there may be an occasion where, in fact, I'll give you a very specific example. This was some some months ago, the president was in Houston for a meeting, and I had a meeting scheduled at Texas Gulf Coast Regional, which lay just outside the 30-mile radius of the TFR. And it was like, I'll be darned if I'm going to let, President of the United States keep me from flying my airplane. I'm going to go fly, by golly. So I filed my IFR flight plan and took off from West Houston Airport and flew down there and had my meeting and filed my flight plan. And by the way, I was in Woodstock, my little yellow 152. Clear, severe, clear, beautiful day outside. And flew back. 99% of the trip was in the TFR, and it was fine. And there was hardly anybody out flying. And the 10-mile no-fly zone, I'm talking about the you get shot down no-fly zone, was 1 mile to the east of West Houston Airport, which is right on the raggedy edge of where you might be flying a left downwind to runway 15. Well, I didn't want any part of that. So there wasn't anybody in the traffic pattern. There wasn't anybody hardly in the air. So I flew right-hand traffic and announced very clearly, flying right-hand downwind to runway 15 due to the TFR, all the way to the ground. And, there's a case where, in my mind, I can justify, I suppose if you want to say breaking the reg, I could justify having done that, because if the alternative is getting shot down, I'm going to break the reg. So anyway, I'm not saying that there are never any circumstances where you might want to differ from what the letter of the law says in favor of complying with what the spirit of the law says. Does that make any sense?
It does. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, Joe Clark here. I want to hit on a couple of things. Number one, there was no discussion of airplanes without radios.
Yeah.
Until they make regulations that require people to have a radio.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm concerned with is that a lot of people are becoming complacent with radios and all of this technology, and they're going to end up in an accident. Christopher Hart, the NTSB chair during the Obama years, he had a great saying. He talked a lot about technology in aviation, and he started several of his presentations with, "I have good news. Technology has come to aviation. And I have bad news. Technology has come to aviation." What you mentioned a moment ago about common sense, that is the most important aspect of this discussion. There are a lot of pilots still flying around in Cubs, Champs, C3s, whatever, that don't have radios, and they're not required to have radios. And they have as much right to be in the air as you with a radio.
Yep.
And so, you got to kind of look out for that. And the other thing, and I mentioned this in the discussion or in the chat, never ever line up and wait on any runway. That is an invitation to a very bad accident. And I'll hit on the February 1st, 1991 accident at LAX. Controller told one aircraft to line up and wait, and a US aircraft, 737, came down and landed right on top of that airplane.
Yeah.
Never, ever. I don't care if it's a towered airport or a non-towered airport. If a controller was to tell me to line up and wait, I would say, thank you, but no. I am ready for an immediate departure. You tell me when I'm cleared to take off. Yeah. But don't ever go out and line up and wait. That's the silliest thing I've ever heard of.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, the Nordo type operators out there, and you're right. They have every bit as much right to the airspace as we do. That was an oversight on my part, Joe, and part of the reason for that is that the airport that I fly out of, although non-towered, doesn't have any airplanes in it based there that are Nordo. And I can't tell you the last time that type of an airplane came in to our airport. And so, you know, I kind of out of sight, out of mind. I should have addressed that.
Yeah, and see, that's one of my concerns is that even though you don't have anyone based there, what happens when somebody shows up in a champ with no radio?
No, you're absolutely right. You know, you've got everybody now that, at least in our airspace, required to have ADSB and out at least.
Mhm.
And a lot of folks have gone ahead and invested ADSB in, you know, in a variety of different types of technologies. But
You know,
we
and
get
in
used to
past-
looking for that little black dot.
Yeah, that's another thing that I have witnessed with pilots. They have the ADSB presentation in the cockpit on their iPads, whatever, and they're not looking out for traffic.
Yeah.
You know, and how many times does ADSB fail?
Yeah.
And
Or you get a
that's-
ghost image or something like that.
Yeah.
I can
So-
remember back,
Ed?
this is a number of years ago. I got a call from a guy that wanted to get checked out. He hadn't flown for a while. This is well before the Rusty Pilot thing. And he'd rented an airplane at West Houston Airport, and he'd call me and ask me if I would check him out in one of the airport's 172s, the flight school's 172s. And we got out to the airport, and the plane that we were supposed to fly had flat tires. So the young lady said, "Look, we just got this G1000 in. Would you like to fly that?" And he and I looked at each other and said, "Sure, why not?" They were going to give it to us the same price. And so the girl handed us a stack of manuals about, like, you know, the yay thick, and said, you know, "Here you go." Took us 20 minutes to figure out how to start the engine. Once we got it started, we took off, and all of a sudden we start hearing this traffic. And where did we look? Not outside where the traffic was, but on the box to see where the little black dots were. And boy, that was a real eye-opening experience for me, and it backs up exactly what you're saying.
I've sat in the back seat of a 172 evaluating what was going on between the student and the instructor. And the student sitting on the left side looking at his television, instructor's on the right side watching his TV, and I'm the only guy in the airplane looking out for traffic. And as a matter of fact, just 2 or 3 weeks ago on General Aviation News, I thought this was a fantastic accident report, because there was a student, an instructor, and a guy in the back seat. They were taxiing out, you know, so thankfully it wasn't a serious accident, but the student was messing around with his iPad. The instructor was messing around with the radios, and the guy in the back seat yelled, "Stop!" And they slammed on the brakes, but it was just a wee bit too late, and they ate up another airplane.
Oh,
Yeah, you know, the common sense thing you mentioned a moment ago, absolutely paramount. And it's I think it was you, Steve, who said aviate, navigate, communicate. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's you make some really good points there. You know, talking about doing things when you're taxiing. I've got a friend, in fact, I talk about this in our Rusty Pilot seminars. I've got a friend that does his run up and sets his radios and tunes in his DG and everything while he's taxiing. And he'll be rocketing down the taxiway at, you know, 35 knots or something like that, weaving like a drunk sailor, and doing all this kind of stuff. And, you know, I just...
Careful with that term.
Are you an ex-sailor?
I could be a drunk sailor. Honestly.
You could be. I should be more politically correct. I apologize. I can see you're smiling. That's good.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's pretty funny. Because my typical saying is, I'm busier than an ass-kicking, a one-legged sailor in an ass-kicking contest.
Yeah, there you go. I guess maybe I should have said a drunken Air Force major, but you know that might.
Okay, go along with that. That accident where the student taxied into another airplane because he was met, and you know, it wouldn't bother me so much if that was one incident.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of pilots who I have breakfast with every Saturday, And he fed me 3 or 4 incidents where people crashed airplanes because of iPads. And I was appalled by that. Absolutely appalled.
It happens. Look at the insurance and insurance rates. You know, insurance rates reflect, you know, these kinds of things. You know, not to get too much into a different subject, but you know, insurance rates are going up partly because the insurance carriers that cover our airplanes are also cover Boeing, and that plus the large amounts of losses that we've had because of hurricanes and tornadoes the last couple of years, plus Boeing. The max is a good reason that our insurance is going up, but it's things like exactly what you talked about right there. It's not paying attention. It's kind of like, you know, texting while you're driving.
There you go. Absolutely. And that's another one. You know, pilots have gotten in trouble for texting in the cockpit. You know, sometimes it drives me a little bit crazy.
Like you said, good news is we've got technology in the cockpit, and the bad news is we've got technology in the cockpit. I'll give you a statistic just real quickly that was true as of a couple of years ago. I suspect it still is, but if you fly a technically advanced aircraft, statistically speaking, you're safer than if you're flying a non-technically advanced aircraft. The downside of that, though, is if you're involved in an accident, you are more likely to die.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think that's a very interesting conundrum almost, I guess, if that's the right
you
word.
stick your nose farther into trouble?
I look back on my own training, and I am a little bit different. I learned how to fly in J3 Cubs back in 1971 for $7 an hour. And the old man who taught me how to fly taught everybody how to fly. There was none of this mess with fooling around with radios. All of the flight training was done in Cubs with a sectional chart, a number 2, a whiz wheel, and a plotter. You went out, you learned, you did everything in the Cub, and you went to the 150. He had 3 Cubs and a 150. You did everything in the Cubs, and then you went to the 150 to learn how to navigate with VOR, talk on the radio, and observe the light gun signals over at the nearby towered field. And what that reinforced in my brain was the fact that you had to fly the airplane first. The number 1 rule, regardless of what's going on, is flying the airplane first. And I found that was one of the things that is most important through all aviation. And my background is a little bit different. Like I said, I started out in Cubs, and I spent time on the USS Nimitz flying attack craft. And the number 1 rule is always fly the airplane. All that other stuff, that's just stuff that you add on later.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Eric, you started to say, Eric Day, I think you started to say something.
Oh, I was just talking about the interesting conundrum with technically advanced aircraft is, does it give you the confidence to stick your nose farther into trouble, basically, because you've got your picture of exactly where the weather is, or at least where it was, and you're tempted to fly where the pixels aren't green or red.
Yeah. Now, you know, you're right about that. The challenge with those, especially the fast airplanes like Columbia's and Cirrus's, or Cirri, I guess is the plural. The problem with those is that you can traverse multiple weather systems fairly quickly. And I've often wondered, because I fly a Cirrus, I fly a Comanche too. I have partnerships in both those airplanes, and to be quite honest with you, I far prefer the Comanche. It's a much more fun airplane to fly, but that's a different subject entirely. If I'm flying if I need an airplane that's got some serious weather capabilities, I'll fly the Cirrus. But I'll tell you, it has bothered me from the first day that I began to fly a Cirrus as to whether or not having the parachute colored my decision making. And I worry about that with pilots coming up these days flying technically advanced aircraft, and maybe they learn how to fly in a Cirrus, which is, I don't misunderstand me. I have no objections to that. Although I do think there's a lot to be said for learning to fly, as Joe mentioned, in an airplane with steam gauges, where you're not so dependent upon technology. And I worry about students that learn how to fly that type of airplane where you're almost taught to fly with the autopilot from day one, because, hey, that's the way those airplanes are designed to be flown. And how well they could handle a real emergency that required some significant stick and rudder skills in order to save their bacon if they didn't have a parachute to let them down. And like I said, to this day, as many hours as I've gotten, I'm still learning. And as many hours I've got in the Cirrus, whenever I launch into some weather that isn't pristine, it's always in the back of my mind, has this decision been colored by the fact that I've got, or unduly influenced by the fact that I've got a parachute? And I don't know that I've ever been able to answer that with absolute certainty.
Right. I was going to make another comment on something you said about the crosswind entry at West Houston. Hank Henry taught me the same thing at that airport. But you're in a very good position. The question was about departing aircraft, and you're actually in a very good perch there that you can see the whole runway, high wing or low wing. You can see the whole runway, and you can really gauge whether someone's going to climb into you or not, or whether they're going to pass under you, or even if there is anyone on the runway. So it's a very high visibility position to be in. I like your idea of perhaps shifting it closer to midfield as the runway gets longer.
Yeah.
There.
It's again common sense, as I think Joe mentioned a couple of times, and Steve mentioned. It's really all about common sense. We have guidelines, but it's impossible for the FAA to issue a regulation that covers every single possibility that you can encounter. Just as it's impossible for the AIM or whoever writes that to anticipate every single variation of a theme on something like this that's non-regulatory in nature beyond the left traffic unless otherwise specified. So like I said, I don't pretend to have all the answers. Some of the opinions that I have are fairly strong, but they're fairly strong because of all of the instruction that I've given and all of the horrible flying I've seen and horrible radio communications that I've heard over the years. And at some point, you just want to scream and say enough is enough. But that's where a lot of the opinions come from, and I'm certainly not inflexible. I think, as illustrated by my opposition to the teardrop entry to the downwind being somewhat softened after a conversation with a guy that does it all the time, and understanding his technique and what he does, and going back and looking at the way the Airplane Flying Handbook recommends that it be done. And if it's done properly, it can be safe. It can be as safe as any of them.
You made an interesting point that I wanted to ask you more about. You were talking about collisions near the airport being same direction traffic. Why do you think that is?
The collisions at the airport being same direction?
Yeah, rather than head on or oblique kind of. Do you think that's relative motion across the winch?
Yeah, again, at this point, I'm totally speculating, but I would think that for the same reason that it's difficult to see airplanes that are head on, probably about the same kind of difficulty factor when you're in trail with somebody or somebody's in trail with you. Probably the same lack of relative motion. Okay. But again, I'm not a physicist. I'm just guessing.
Okay. Thank you for your time tonight, and to Jeremy and Ken. Appreciate it. Yeah,
thank you for it's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, Pat, thank you very much. We could go on and on and on all night. This is just awesome stuff. So, Pat, I just want to tell you how much I really appreciate your time for participating tonight.
My pleasure.
This is something that I'm really enjoying doing. This was the third event, and I think that it went really well. And due to popular demand, we're going to continue doing these right on. I've got a laundry list of some influencers, educators that are going to be participating in future Breaking the Chains. I'll host some from time to time, but I'm going to go ahead and have some other expertise come on board as well. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. One of the things that I'd like to say is, again, thank you all for participating. Thank you for all of my repeated offenders who love to come and be a part of this mission. And I can't thank you enough for your support. For those of you who have just joined for tonight for the very first time, I mentioned that I've got a YouTube channel. I also teach. I also host these seminars, and I also have, like I said, with the YouTube channel. Check it out. It's All American Aviation. Glance over it. And I already mentioned about what my overall mission is. And then for those of you who are interested in getting wings credit, if you could shoot me an email so that I can validate that you were here the whole time, so I can assign you wings credit for this evening. And then also, if you could go check out Ken Viard's Pilot Partner Program at the link that you see there. For those of you who are listening on Facebook Live, or for those of you who will be watching on the YouTube channel and you haven't flown in a while, check out AOPA's Rusty Pilot program, because it is really a great program for getting pilots back into the cockpit. Tonight, we talked about non-towered airport operations. And one closing comment I'd like to say about non-towered airport operations: you can have all of the fancy tools, you can have all the radio calls that you want, but nothing replaces see and avoid all traffic. So that being said, thank you again, Pat. And I'd like for all of you to join me in 2 weeks on May 20th as we have another webinar, this time on towered airport operations. And it will be presented by a pilot and an air traffic controller. He's dual hat, Matt Wells from North Texas. And he's also the producer from a YouTube channel called In the Hangar, which some of you may have heard of. So that's all I've got for tonight, folks. Next slide, Ken. Let this be a good burning image to go out through the next 2 weeks. And if you can get to flying, go have some fun, be safe, and come on back. Thanks, everybody, for your support. Remember, shoot me the email. Have a good
Thanks,
night.
Jeremy, and I'm going to fly seaplanes with you shortly.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's going to be a blast.
We're going to do
We'll
it.
have a restaurant to go eat at. So, all right. Thanks, Pat. As always, it's always good.